Okay, so now I can further delay. I just started. So this is I'm going to base this talk very much on the paper because I thought yeah, I can just go wrong if I too much deviate from that. So this is the title of the paper: Housing Commodification and Increasing Potential Ground Rents in Post-Socialist Budapest. And we wrote together this paper with my colleagues Borbála Simonovic, Anikó Bernát, and Adrian Csizmady. Here you can see their affiliations. And yeah, well, for any controversy or problems, I take responsibility for the contents of this paper. And now I try to yeah. So here's this first quote. I always use this quote in these talks. I'm a little bit surprised that gentrification has not gone so far. I thought it would have gone. I've been tricked by the institutional issues, the complexity of publicly owned vis-a-vis privately owned housing. So this was said by Neil Smith himself in 2010 when he visited Budapest again. And then later, 6 years later, it was published by these colleagues who organized his visit. So I use this quote just to have an argument, like why the case of Budapest could be interesting for the international audience. So I will talk about this the introduction and the theory of gentrification just very briefly. I will just run through these slides. So the rent gap, according to rent gap theory, according to my understanding, it depends on. It says that land rent depends on disinvestment, reinvestment cycles, and filtering and gentrification is explained actually by the same mechanism. Well, ultimately, it's based on the assumption of falling rate of profit. And where there are empirical and theoretical problems, I will jump over that slide as well because of time constraints. But then in the discussion, we can get back to that. So in the recent literature, the possible way out from these problems of the rent gap theory is the potential ground rent. So like in this paper of Clark and Pissin, already mentioned by the call for this special issue, it's there that it's potential rent that creates the tension in rent gaps. But there is remarkably little written on what it is and how it comes into being. So this is a rather big difference compared to the original rent gap theory. And yeah, the question is what affects potential ground rent. There is an answer for this in the literature. I will talk about this, and of course we add something to this answer. And here is just very quickly this figure from Wachsmuth and Weisler, 2018. So just so this the A graph just shows the original idea of rent gap theory. So when there is no investment in the built environment, then the capitalized ground rent will decrease and the gap arises. But on the figure C, we can see that even without the capital depreciation, there can be a rent gap if the potential ground rent increases for some reason. And yeah, I will try to talk about what are these possible reasons are. So in our paper, we say that it's also the historically, socially, and politically defined commodification levels and related to that effective demand that affects potential ground rent. So beyond the asymptomatic logic of capital accumulation, the social and political factors behind speculation on the potential rent and price is something we concentrate on in the case of Budapest. And the issue with Budapest, so the reason why Smith was surprised by the lower level of gentrification that he assumed in 1996 was that after the regime change, besides the neoliberal relations, we could see also neo-patrimonial political and economic relations. And this worked against the commodification of housing until the early 2010s. And later, the short-term rentals and the patrimonialization of housing with the restriction of mortgage market created a speculative spiral. This speculation created a higher commodification level, and then this increased the perceived higher potential ground rent. However, in Hungary or Budapest, housing is less commodified and financialized than in contexts with large housing companies with concentrated ownership and with more international investors. And the goal of this whole paper and talk is, the further goal is beyond the revision of the rent cap mechanism, is the revision of the concept of rent in general. So we are very much inspired by the works of Ivan Szelenyi and his colleagues about rents. So their suggestion about rents as close social relations is seem to be very useful for our goals. So we try to argue for a more substantive understanding of these rent relations and beyond the logic of value production. So this is our further argument that, this is how rents can be so far from real economic contexts. For example, in case of Ponzi schemes, of this too big to fail, but also in cases of when people get benefits, where there is solidarity. And these are considered by Szelenyi rents, always related to exclusion and inclusion, and that is related to patrimonialization. So in this slide, I'm going to talk only about our definitions. There were a lot of definitional debates about gentrification. I was quite vexed by those because in an everyday language, people completely understand what gentrification is. They see that they either cannot enter that housing market on that given part of the city, or they are being effectively displaced, or they are pushed, day by day or year by year. It's harder and harder for them to live there. Many definitions of gentrifications include the whole mechanism, the whole process. And then if we debate the mechanism, then it's misleading to put the mechanism as part of the definition. So this decreasing housing affordability in a location can happen without a substantial investment in the built environment, as Waxmund and Weisler shows, and others with this short-term rental literature, and as our case shows it. And then, surprisingly, until the mid or late 2010s, we see that the original reason behind the rent gaps, this lack of investment, maintenance, is still maintained. By Smith, PGR is only, the potential ground rent, this is how it's abbreviated, is only mentioned basically one time at the book, and then it's referred to. So I skipped this slide now about the criticism because it's very dense and long, but we can get back to it. I just concentrate on the issue of contextual differences and the differences in governance or political goals. So I was not satisfied with this idea of hybridized neoliberalism or neoliberalism in different forms, exactly because it still maintains the domination of neoliberalism. It's just painted to a different color, but it's the same thing. And because of this, the political mechanisms working against the neoliberal tendencies remain under-theorized. So with this notion of patrimonialism and neo-patrimonialism, I try to theorize these issues that are not exactly neoliberal. So if if not disinvestment creates the chance of higher profit, then what? The current answer in the literature is like the cooperation and conspiracy of the political and propertied class, like they withdraw their possible housing from the market, they don't build it, they create political narrative to segment the markets, they create political propaganda for this. So this were in the literature. And the other issue that can inflate the potential ground rent is financialization. I mean, suggested by the literature. And then, yeah, there is this question, the rules of this question applies here, that the answer is always no. So is this cooperation in the relation between mortgages, and is this cooperation so self-explanatory, and is this relation between mortgages and gentrification is so self-explanatory, so simple that more financialization, more gentrification, etc. So why am I questioning this? So, looking through the literature, you find that the political contexts very much matter in how actually PGR is influenced. So there can be, as in these examples, there can be examples where the political interest is actually not to push potential ground rent as high as possible. And the other issue is that in these urban renewal / gentrification processes, there is a cooperation between the local politics and economic power, but then it's very far from a global free market. Rather, these particular connections create selective advantages for certain capitalists. So, and on the other hand, or from another point of view, there are in these cases clear differences between property rights. So, for example, in the case I cited from Ernesto, you see that the individual owners of housing have much weaker property rights than the large development companies. And we see that also in the Turkish case, where nepotism, through nepotism, state violence is used against actual owners. But then we see the opposite of this, for example, in the Greek and also in the Hungarian and Budapest case, where the property rights of individual owners is protected, even against current rules, or it's just it had a political motive to make these small owners ownership rights stronger. So what we see in the literature, even if the literature's goal is not this, but then their scientific description tells us this, that there is a much narrower political support than the owners class in general. And there is this recent literature, for example, this paper about elite capture from Lauerman and Malak, exactly saying this, that political interests are not necessarily completely interlocked with class interests. So, and the reason, the result is that there is an incomplete commodification due to this selective political creation of rents. Yeah. So, how commodification comes in the picture? So, because of this, not necessarily maximizing PGR and exchange value, it also means that instead of an ever-increasing commodification, there can be decommodification. That this can be the political program, and this is what Matthias Ben was writing about in his recent book of commodification gap. So he shows there are a lot of examples where political interest is actually going against commodification, or he uses the example of Russia to show that there can be cases with limited commodification or non-commodification, because of the institutional, because of the social context that is created. So, and then it can be changed, this commodification level in case by case. So commodification is not a one-way street. It's not like it's just being pushed forward. And here I use the example of like deregulation. So it can mean like globalization and on operating markets, deregulation can be just mean there's more commodification. But then in cases where property rights and free market competition is not necessarily a given, their non-regulation can just increase risks for the market players. And that means limited commodification or non-commodification. Market players just don't step on the market, or they invest small or something like quick and sure, but it's not like pushed forward so relentlessly. And on the other hand, in given cases, in the slide before, in the cases of like systemic corruption, there can be rents created by political power. So this is the other side of the same coin. So some cannot enter this market, cannot gain rents and profits of their investment, but others, with the help of political power, do. And especially in cases where the corruption is a mode of rule. So commodification levels depend on political power too. It's not necessarily, and it is not necessarily neoliberal free markets dominated by capital interests. So there has to be there exists some alternatives or other sides of governance beyond neoliberal governments. About neo-patrimonial relations, so it was like it's difficult to put this in the paper, but we mean here, I mean, following Ivan Salini's work, these are kind of feudal relations, so political power, and in the Hungarian case and also in the Russian case, the state power captured by political power can grant advantages for selectively for central fractions of the owner class, and also for lower status social groups with, for example, selective populist measures in exchange for political loyalty. So this is something quite similar to clientelism and elite capture. The differentiation is that, you know, where it is initiated, and in neo-patrimonialism, as in the feudal Europe, it was the political power, it was the military potential of the king that granted these rights at the end of the day. But it's quite similar to clientism and elite capture. And these politically created economic dominance then create also dependency of those who are employed by these economic players. And people really deeply understand this. They understand that this, in the Hungarian examples, this countryside factory could not work without the EU money channeled into the company. And this is all controlled by the political power. So at the end of the day, they vote for the neo-patrimonial power because they know that without that, they wouldn't have a job. Very quickly about our methodology. So we used two researches. One of them is a long-term research about qualitative field research about touristification in Budapest, and the other research was an interview research with short-term rental owners. And what it showed us, this qualitative data, was how and why investment and income opportunities created by these historical, social, and regulatory changes that happened in Budapest were recognized by so-called marginal landlords, we quote this from a paper, or cash poor landlords. This is also very often used in the Hungarian context. I will explain what this means. So we illustrate how perception of locality inner city housing was transformed into a speculative asset. Before that, it was like not considered so valuable, and this has changed in our story. But there were a lot of further factors, so we are not saying that only these short-term rentals and whatnot changed it. So we are talking about the housing privatization, mortgage regulations, and patrimonialization of housing. So marginal landlords or cash poor landlords. So what happened in Hungary? It was a socialist regime before 1989. The inner city of Budapest was owned by the state, managed by the local authorities, and people rented for a very low price these usually very dilapidated apartments and buildings. And the privatization method in Hungary, which was different in every post-socialist country, was privatization to the sitting tenants on very low prices, and this created a super home ownership situation and a residual and unregulated rental market. And with this sort of privatization, condominiums were created. This is a legal category when the building consisting of apartments is also in the undivided shared ownership of these apartment owners. So this means that there are families with or individuals with very different financial situation living in the building, and then they should agree let's say about the refurbishment of the roof. But it rarely happens because especially earlier it needed a unanimous vote, so everybody had to agree. And this was already recognized by Neil Smith and later by Zoltán Kovács and colleagues. This resulted in a very dilapidated housing stock, yet since 2014, prices increased substantially. What you see today in Budapest is that buildings are painted from the outside, but very rarely actually the whole maintenance of the building is done. There are beautifully renewed apartments, but for example, the water pipes going into the apartment are still made of lead from the end of 19th century, early 20th century. So you have a very expensive inner city apartment looking wonderful, but the water is poisonous there. And then because of this process, because of this privatization for sitting tenants was so successful, social rental housing became residual. So currently it's only a few percent of the housing stock. And of course, this has already very negative consequences for the lower status residents of the inner city. And this was reinforced later, this privatization process and the super home ownership model by the cheap FX mortgages before 2008. But there was, of course, a very hard landing in case of Hungary, for sure. So because of this hard landing, they changed the mortgage regulation. And at the end of the day, it meant that it became much harder to get a mortgage. So before that, I made interviews with people who had very low income and had nothing and still get a large amount of money from the bank, and then they got in huge trouble. It was not allowed anymore. And where this resulted a severe restriction of mortgage lending in Hungary. And the mortgage GDP ratio is currently the lowest in Europe. Percentage of mortgage paying owners is half of the average. But the amount of mortgages crawled back by 2020 to the pre-28 level. It became much more concentrated. So what happened is now we see a generation rent and a patrimonialization of housing. By this, Boland, Seabrook, and us, and we mean that a higher status family can put together enough money to become owner, and it becomes a family issue, actually. So it depends on the family wealth, as in the wealthy aristocratic families of the feudal Europe. So this patrimonialization word is used again, independent from Mussolini, actually. And what happened is that since the mid-2010s, from 25% to the percentage of investment buyers jumped from 25% to 45%. So before that, whoever got a mortgage just wanted to be owner-occupier. And this changed after the restriction of mortgage lending. And then there were other factors. For example, it turned out after the financial crisis, it still went on for a while, but then several Hungarian brokerage companies in billions and billions of euros of savings turned out to be Ponzi schemes. So this also pushed money to the housing market. And there were also this natalist housing policy of the regime. So actually the restriction and the concentration of mortgage lending boosted speculation. And the rationale is that demand for rental will always be there. This generation rent will never be able to buy. So it's a very safe investment to put the money in housing. And here I just show, so this was with the red circle, the pre-2008 situation. Here, these dots show like how many contracts were there. And this number of contracts decreased substantially. And then we see the same periods of time. This graph shows how housing prices changed in Budapest. So we see very clearly that after the mortgage crisis, when mortgages were restricted, we got into a new speculative era of housing in Budapest. Here I just show the big jump in the investment purpose buying. And this is a graph from a paper by Cory Horstenbach and Manuel Albers, who show something very similar in the case of the Netherlands, where the GDP mortgage ratio decreasing, but housing prices still increase. So this connection is not so, connection between mortgages and housing prices is not that direct. The other issue I want to talk about is the residual and non-regulated rental markets. So both tenants and cash pool landlords find this current institutional situation with private rentals very risky. These are just simple civil contracts, no guarantees, no safety. There are no special institutions or rules. And there is a lot of illegal tax evasion, and there is an absolute lack of control of these small individual landlords renting out apartments. And yeah, already, even in 2018, 40% it was for acquaintances, so like friend of a friend or relative. And this sort of tax evasion is not possible for institutional landlords. So there is, again, this selectivity between different type of owners. And this is why institutional landlords are missing from the Hungarian market. And because of this high perceived risks, 10% of the inner city housing was just left empty. And after neo-patrimonial unfinished urban renewal, that was just a way to channel out money from the local authorities, a tourist boom happened in Budapest, because of the low-cost airlines and basically this new fashion of visiting cities. So half of the rental housing from the mid-2000s went to short-term rentals. However, our real estate market experts said that there is already an overcapacity of short-term rentals. So why people went to short-term rentals are explanation is that they understood it more safe, the short-term rental business, than the private rentals. So these two factors were already quite strong push for speculation on scarcity and closure of ownership. So this closure created further potential rent increase. Meanwhile, there aren't that much housing built as in contexts where foreign investors would enter the markets. So here it's hard to in a presentation like this, but to tell these stories, to tell these interview stories. I just gave here a few examples. The stories were about these cash pool landlords who burned themselves again and again. They trusted, they hoped for long-term tenants, but since their apartment was in bad condition, they were already in the lower segment of the market, and it happened again and again that the tenants didn't pay, and the landlords, who are also cash poor, couldn't refurbish their apartments, or were very much missing this income they counted with. The other quote is just saying, as in many cases, that tax evasion is basically the norm. I mean, illegal tax evasion. And then the other, the third quote is just saying that it's not necessarily the high income from short-term rentals which pushed people for this market, but you know, this perceived risk that was pushed their people. And I think it's a strange thing to understand it like this. Again, this is the institutional context that makes this weird commodification by decreasing risk on the short-term rental market. So to wrap up the case I try to talk about, so the commodification was pushed by the lack of alternatives on the asset market, speculation on closure of property ownership, generation rent, with this relative or perceived safety of short-term rentals compared to long-term rentals. And while there are the factors of non-commodification, like this differentiation between individual landlords and institutional landlords, where individual landlords just can cheat with their taxes. It's almost like a gentleman's agreement between the state and them. With these uncertain property rights that are in Hungary, so I don't have time to talk about this, but the state basically have preemptive purchase rights for a lot of property and companies in Hungary. And of course, the international capitalists know this. So especially in real estate investments, it's an issue, and this sort of uncertainty. And then on the other hand, like real economic factors for this kind of property pricing increase is actually missing. So population of Hungary is decreasing. The current economic situation is like, doesn't make it, and political situation doesn't make Hungary such a welcoming destination. And yet we see also currently the property price and the rent increase. So we are at a limited level of commodification, but in a new speculative era of the housing market. And yeah, I just quote our conclusions here. So these political economic cliques within classes and political interests across classes influence the investment potentials and their realization. So whose private property is defended by the state and who can gain rents. And beside the institution of land ownership, political support is needed too for urban investment. And as we presented, this is not automatically given everywhere. So there are particular social mechanisms affecting markets and property relations, and they are integral parts of the creation of rent gaps. I don't know if I